Hi, Cara.
Hi, Vanessa. You're feeling
Well,
grumpy this morning. Maybe you're tired and sleepy and in a growth spurt.
I mean, there are days when I wake up and I'm like, am I in a growth spurt? I mean, I guess technically, in some ways, we are all in growth spurts all the time because we're regenerating cells, and many of us are often, you know,
Oh,
changing our bodies.
I thought that was a reference to how we're growing as humans, but okay.
We are also growing as humans every day. I will give you that rose-colored look at our humanity.
Thank you
Yes.
for indulging me.
Yes. But the growth spurts that we're going to talk about today are different kind of growth spurts. And one of my favorite parts of our book, which I hope when you search it up on our membership on Less Awkward, this math equation comes up. But there is a math equation in our chapter on growth spurts in This Is So Awkward. And it is an answer to one of the questions that we get very often, which is how tall is my kid going to be? So we will get there as part of this conversation. But this episode,
let's just jump in though and answer the burning question. What equation? We're going to get into it. It's called the mid-parental height equation.
And listeners might be shocked that I didn't lead with the name of the equation because it's
so sexy
title.
I knew you were going there.
Yeah,
but I am looking it up on
Are you looking it up on
our
membership?
Yes, and so it's a great one to
it's a great one. And if you didn't have the pleasure of writing the book with Cara as I did, you will not have been privy to the process that we went through with our editors about how they were presenting the equation in the written page of our book. I also personally was not privy to how Cara described it when reading that portion of the audiobook. And I'm also dying to know
you mean how I actually said a very complicated math equation in words?
Yes.
Yeah. I love when Scott Galloway reads his books and he's like, now you are looking at a chart. And the first bullet point says,
oh God, that's
I love it. It speaks to me. So if you like that, you'll like the mid-parental height equation.
Yes. I think it's the only math equation in the book. But what does it look like on the membership when you pull up the mid-parental? And so the mid-parental height equation is a way to figure out about how tall your kid will be based on a calculation that involves the biological parent's height and another series of steps.
Yeah. So on the membership, when you type in to our awkward bot mid-parental height equation, it comes up with an error message that says maybe you mean something else, which will not happen by the time this episode airs, but it's a good reminder to everyone who's a member. If you hit a roadblock when you're looking something up in the awkward bot and you know that information's supposed to be there, email us, DM us, let us know there's a roadblock because every piece of content we've ever created has been uploaded. And sometimes it's a matter of putting the hyphen in the right place or taking the space out of the wrong place in order to get the content up. So there we go, Vanessa. That's what comes up. But I will tell you, we will get into mid-parental height equation because I think in this episode, what people really want to know is the following. So when do kids have a growth spurt? We'll get to that. How much do they grow during a growth spurt? We'll get to that. When the growth spurt is over, are they done? We'll get to that. And then if I want to predict how tall my kid is, we'll leave the mid-parental height equation to the end for like a little handy at the end of the episode where you can actually do the math and see within a 2-inch in either direction best guesstimate, you can figure out how tall a kid genetically should be. But of course, there are lots of things that factor into that. So, I mean, let's jump into just what a growth spurt is. Let's start with that, what that phrase means. And then we'll get into the when it happens and the before and after. Dr. Vanessa, do you want to take a stab at growth spurt?
Okay, let me put on my white coat here. I mean, the most important thing when we talk about growth spurts, from my perspective, the most important thing is to make sure that people know that growth spurts are not just about how tall someone's going to get, the growth in height, because growth spurts involve weight gain, they involve increased musculature, they involve added curves for some people. And there's no one size fits all. And it's a variety of different ways that kids grow throughout the stage of life. And not only is their growth not kind of within a mold, but also the timeline for the growth is so varied. So we can give general guidance about a lot of stuff with the really important caveat that it varies from kid to kid. And as we always say, and we think it's the funniest thing we say, which is there's no one normal, right? There's lots and lots and lots of
This
typicals.
is the funniest thing we say.
And then this is Cara's favorite thing. And then there's also no one normal. Like we're all weird in the best possible way.
I mean, it's such a good line, right? There's no one normal and there's no one normal.
And I sort of wonder if we should have like called
Made
all
that
our
the
stuff.
title of our book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did we talk about it? I mean,
I
who
don't know.
remembers? We
could do
so
a
many
whole
titles.
podcast about that.
I know.
I want to get into your definition of growth spurt because there's just like puberty, there's a narrow definition and a broad definition. Narrow is just the path to reproductive maturity. And then the broader definition is all the things that are impacted by the sex hormones that lead you on that path to reproductive maturity, right? Narrow, wide. So too, is there a narrow and wide definition of growth spurts? So the narrow definition is about height gain. The broader definition, which is what you've just described, is about all of the ways our bodies change shape. Height gain, weight gain, shape shifting, curves, et cetera, et cetera. This episode is going to really focus on height more than the others, mostly because that's the metric that's the most predictable. And when people ask, how tall is my kid going to be? They actually want to know how tall is a kid going to be. Often what they are not asking is how tall are they going to be and how are they going to be shaped? How are they going to be shaped is a question many people want to know that is a separate question, and there are other predictive variables. So we might dip and dive with a little bit of the weight and curve information, but we'll keep this content fairly tight around height because there's a lot to know. So let's get going. And we're going to start with actual growth spurts. What does it mean to be in a growth spurt? How much do they grow and when do they get into it? So the definition of a growth spurt is different for the different genders. And this doesn't mean that just because a girl is a girl or a boy is a boy, they are in a very fixed, rigid height parameter. You know, I'm going to throw out some numbers here. And there are some bodies that overshoot and some bodies that undershoot. We will talk about those in a second. But in general, the female growth spurt, you grow 2 to 3 inches a year for 2 to 3 years. And in the male growth spurt, you grow 3 to 4 inches a year for 3 to 4 years, actually 2 to 4 years, most people say. So one thing that's interesting is you can just see, based upon those two definitions, where males tend to gain their height over females. Because until the point of the growth spurt, the genders are pretty even in height. Like the shorter kids, the middlings, and the tallest kids, it's really not gender segregated. And then around like 5th and 6th grade, the girls tend to outpace boys in their height. And we'll get into the timing of growth spurts. But the boys, on average, catch up and then surpass the girls.
So one of the cool things that I learned when we were writing the book, which I did not know until I read your writing about growth spurts, was that kids grow from the extremities, and the last place to grow is the trunk of the body. And so, I mean, obviously, I'd always noticed that kids are like puppies with these big feet and these big hands, and often a sort of a short torso. But I never sort of thought that there was like a literal moving from extremity to core in terms of their growth. And it's a very fun and cool thing. And you can often tell when a kid is in the middle of their growth spurt because it looks like they're walking around on like skis because their feet are so big, but the rest of their growth hasn't caught up with that yet.
I know. I mean, one of my favorite things that we wrote about was how every grandparent at some point will comment on how their grandchild is all legs, right? And there's this thing where so the hands and feet grow first, and next the arms and legs grow. And there's this stage that now that you're thinking about it, right? Almost every person can picture in their mind's eye when a kid looks like they're all legs. And it's not that they're all legs, it's that their trunk hasn't grown yet, right? The centermost hasn't stretched and grown. Interestingly, really interestingly, is when you think about on the other end of life, why do people shrink? Why do we lose height? And we lose it not because our arms and legs are shrinking, although limb length changes a little and shoe size for sure changes for a lot of people, but it's because the vertebrae in our spine go from having nice height to losing maybe a millimeter or 2 millimeters slowly over time. And you have multiple vertebrae up your spinal column. And so that math adds up. And that is where people lose their vertical height as they get older. It's each little vertebrae kind of collapsing into itself just a little bit. It's the opposite of what is happening at the end of the pubertal growth spurt. So yes, you start on the outside and the growth spurt works its way in. The other thing about growth spurts is, and I made reference to it earlier, but it's this disparate timing between the genders, right? So
right
before kids ever head into a growth spurt, right? Anyone who's ever been to a pediatrician's office knows they plot kids' growth on this growth chart. And if you look at the height chart between the ages of about 2 or 3, all the way up till, on the charts, it usually looks like 13 or 14. It's different on different charts, but it's just a straight line of anticipated growth. And that's because kids grow somewhere between 1 and 2 inches a year, every single year. And that is what is predicted. Some years they get a little bit more, some years a little bit less, but it averages out to be about 1.5 inches a year. And that's that very straight line you see until the pubertal growth spurt. But then what happens is girls hit their growth spurt first. So, Vanessa, we love getting into what happens in 5th and 6th grade with these girls towering.
Yeah. I mean, you can have, I'm thinking about the bat mitzvah pictures where you have the girls are like, a foot taller than the boys out on the dance floor. And anyone who grew up in our generation, they might have been dancing at, people my age to Red Wine or Kokomo. Cara, I don't know what the slow dance was in your
what the slow
era.
dance opportunities were. Yeah, I'm not going to date myself, but might have been Lionel Richie. Might have been.
Oh, hello.
Yeah. Hello.
So there's this fascinating thing because they're developmentally the same age. Although I just read some research in Ruth Whitman's book. We're going to have her on later this summer. She wrote Boy Mom, and she talks about some of the brain research indicating that boys' brain development lags behind girls by a year or 2. But generally, we say that kids the same age are on the same, assuming there's no, that there's no neurodiversity, that they are along the same lines in terms of brain development, but they look years apart. That's before we ever get to breast development or anything like that. You just clock them and they're, a foot apart in height. And My wonderful brother Nick was that kid at a bar mitzvah who was so tiny, and he was dancing with girls who were so much taller than he was that he looked like their baby brother on the dance floor, even though they were basically the same age. And there are boys who are early bloomers, and we'll get to them. I just want to make one comment about what it's like for those girls who, some of whom are early blooming in every way, right? They have breasts and hips and all of that. And some of them are just tall, but, kind of not curvy and not necessarily developed. And over the years, you and I have talked to many women who fell into that category, and they've talked about what it feels like to be that girl. And I would say generally what we've heard from people is that it's hard. That they tried to make themselves smaller physically. They changed their posture. Maybe they went quieter in terms of like how much they talked to make themselves smaller in other ways. It's not uncomplicated, this height growth. And we always think about growth spurts and height growth with boys and how it's so coveted. And we'll talk about that. But Cara, I just want to spend a minute talking about the experience for girls.
Yeah. I mean, think about the posture. I want to sort of, I want to paint a picture for you. I want you to imagine in your mind's eye a young girl with no confidence, who feels badly about herself, who's, just you walk into a room and you can read that kid does not have confidence. What's the first thing that comes to your mind about what that kid's body position might be? For me, Vanessa, it's how you just described a girl who is taller than most others. They try to actually make themselves smaller by rolling their shoulders in, by ducking their head down a little, by flexing their neck a little, right? They're literally trying to take up less space, which is a body language that confers lack of confidence. And the opposite is also true. A body language that confers confidence is one that tries to take up more space, shoulders back, neck extended, right? Head held high. It's just a really good reminder in the context of a conversation about growth that maybe it's about their confidence. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's actually just about the fact that they're much taller and they don't want to be. Maybe the fact that they're much taller makes them feel less confident. But we've talked to so many kids and we've gotten a range of responses. So I think it's helpful, everything we do is pointing towards being in conversation instead of assuming that a tall kid lacks confidence. Just being in conversation with them about how they feel about their height is probably the better way to go.
Yeah. And I think, in our generation, girls were really just beginning to play sports in a competitive way. And so there wasn't as much value placed on girls' height because most people weren't playing competitive sports. In this generation, there are lots of girls playing competitive sports where height is really valued. And so, some girls may feel great about it. And again, that's another reason to be in conversation and to say, I can't count the number of times I said to one of my kids, like, come on, stand up straight, pull your shoulders back. Like, instead of saying to them, I'm noticing that your posture changed. I'm wondering, are you conscious of your posture changing? Like, why did your posture change? But I immediately went to the sort of accusatory or the definitive rather than leading with curiosity. So if you're seeing that, and it's not just like in an annoying family photo, but it's sort of day in and day out, it's an opportunity to get curious. Now, here's an interesting part about the first and tallest girls is that they usually don't stay that way because of the course of female growth spurts. So, Cara, do you want to describe what typically happens to those earliest, tallest girls?
Right. So you enter your growth spurt. Unlike brain development, which is independent of puberty, the growth spurt is actually quite entangled with puberty. Most people enter their growth spurt around Tanner stage 4. Tanner stage 4, remember there are 5 Tanner stages. 1 is you're not in it. 5 is you're pretty much done. and 2, 3, and 4 is your path through it. So you're in the later stages of puberty when you enter your growth spurt. Also, just a reminder that just because puberty is starting earlier these days doesn't mean it's going any faster. So I'll be interested in seeing data over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, looking at how the timing of each of these stages is stretching out along with the path through puberty. But if you are going through your growth spurt in Tanner stage 4, that means that you're probably going to be done with puberty in the foreseeable future. And if someone else in your class has not gone through their growth spurt, their Tanner stage 4 is further off. The end of their puberty is further off. So it's all a very mashed up way of saying the girls who go through a growth spurt early tend to finish puberty earlier. They tend to not just grow quickly, but then stop growing. And here's why. So at the end of puberty in a female body, it's the estrogen levels that signal to the growth plates in the bones that they should fuse and close and the bones should not grow anymore. And estrogen, now in the male body, estrogen plays a role, but it's not the only role. And there are other chemical messengers in the female body too, but it's the higher estrogen loads in female bodies that do a lot of that really clear signaling to tell the growth plates, guys, we're good, like zip it, you're done. So once a young female, a tween or teen female is through the later stages of puberty with regularly cycling estrogen levels and regular periods and all that, all of the chemical messengers are out there telling the growth plates, you're good. Not just stop growing, go away, disappear, close. And once the growth plates are closed, the bones don't grow anymore. That is the only place where bones grow. And the growth plates, is a little reminder, they're not throughout the bone, they're on the ends of the bone. So if you picture like a classic bone that a dog might chew, a classic bone with sort of a long, narrow shaft in the middle and then some bubbling out on either end. It's right before that bubbling out on either end that the growth plates exist. They exist on either end. And side note, for kids that get fractures in bones, one of the reasons to do an x-ray is you're always looking to see, did the fracture go through the growth plate? Because if it did, and it could possibly disrupt growth along the growth plate, you might have uneven growth in one bone as opposed to its corollary bone of the body, right arm, right leg, left leg. So if you've got a 6th grader, 5th grade, 6th grade, into 7th grade, she's growing 3 inches a year, and she's had her period for a couple of years, and the growth spurt ends, she is close to her adult height. And meanwhile, the guys in the class and many of the other girls in the class are just starting. So the tall, sort of 5'2", 5'3", 6th grader who is towering over everyone might end up being the 5'3" or 5'4" adult female, and other people may surpass her. And the last thing I'll say is, you notice I didn't stop her at 5'2". And that's because when your growth spurt is over, you're not done growing. I mean, it's possible. And there are a lot of variables that impact growth, and we can talk about those. But by and large, you eke out an extra inch or two after your growth spurt. It just takes a long time.
And in contrast, when we think about boys, and I want to, before we get into the science of exactly, you talked about some of boys' growth spurts, but we'll talk about the hormone impact and the sort of trajectory. I want to layer over that some sociological elements, which is our culture's obsession with men and height. And there's just a complete, like, I kind of can't believe it, because I feel like so much in our culture has changed and people have sort of opened their minds up, but there's just this fixation on how tall are my sons going to be, or how tall am I going to be if I'm a kid? And there's this incredible pressure. So I would just ask parents to try to neutralize that dynamic in your own home. I mean, listen, you may come from a household where each parent is well over 6 feet, in which case, yes, it would be quite surprising if your biological child was not also very tall. And there are, exceptions. And you may come from a household where one parent is super tall and one parent is quite short, and, and everything in between. But to have a kid feel like their worth is based on their height, which is in many ways quite out of their control, although we can talk about the few things that kids and families can do to sort of maximize height. It's like you should have blue eyes, even though you are genetically destined to have brown eyes. Like, there's only so much you can do, and your worth is not tied up in whether you have blue eyes or brown eyes. Your worth is tied up in what kind of human being you are, and how kind you are, and how hard you work, and what you do for others. Like, your worth is not tied up on whether you hit 6 feet or don't hit 6 feet. And yet these kids are just subjected to this incredible pressure. It's on us to change that.
One of the things I love most about this chapter in our book is that you hit your conversational stride in the how to talk about it section here, because there are lots of ways into conversation with kids about that. But you have this incredible way of balancing, okay, this is what the world values. Got it. Like, let's acknowledge it. Let's own it. Let's have a conversation around that. And then, but here's the reality about sort of what my value system is, or what your other parents' value system is, or why we hope this might be your value system around height. And you do it in such an accessible way. I encourage people to read those conversation starters. There are like 24 of them that get into how to talk about not just height. This is where we get to curves and weight and all of it. And like, how do we own the way the world sees these things, which we have to.
Mm-hmm.
And also, we talk about what the reality is for a given kid. Or frankly, if you have a kid, like I had an early blooming boy who was clearly going to be tall. And it wasn't that he went through his growth spurt early, ended it early, and then he was done. He went through his growth spurt early. He got to a tall adult male height, and then he ended his growth spurt. This was never his issue. We still had these conversations because there's the critical piece of empathy building for the fact that one of their best friends might not be living in the same type of body, and they may be facing the biases of the world, or kids who do get height need to be aware of the privilege it gives them, and need to, I think they need to like say thank you, no thank you to that privilege, and prove themselves in other ways, right?
But also, the kids who get height early don't all end up at 6 feet, right?
No,
there are kids
they
who
don't.
get height early who end up at 5'8", and they have all sorts of wonderful athletic advantages in, 6th, 7th, 8th grade.
That's
and
right.
then everybody catches up with them and then surpasses them. And they were understandably depending on their height for all that time. And then they lose that advantage. And
That's
that
right.
can be really hard for the kid who was an early bloomer and then loses that edge. Having said that, and I will make a generalization here through sort of observational and anecdotal experience, and Car, you may know some data on this. I don't. I think being an early blooming boy has certain advantages that I have not seen to have for early blooming girls, that I think our society, our culture, it weighs out in favor of early blooming boys than girls. You may disagree.
There's some data that suggests that the earliest blooming kids in general, and the girl data is very clear here, but the boy data seems to be coming in, are at risk because they look older,
right?
And they are asked to do things or to participate socially in ways that they are not ready for. We have to weigh that risk against the clear benefit of, taller males have more social status on account of their height, Now, they may lose that social status on account of their personality. Okay. and likewise, I think this is really important. There's a ton of anecdotal information out there about later blooming boys who end up shorter, who gain a lot of status on account of their personality, that they work very, very hard to make up for their height. And that can be a huge benefit. So it can work out anyway, but I want to go through the science of—
Wait, I just want to remind people we have 2 episodes with people like that. One is my brother, Nick, and one is my husband, Roger, who were both late blooming boys who never ended up particularly tall, but talk on both those episodes. They're some of our first episodes about the ways in which they developed other sides of themselves because they knew I'm never going to be, a 6'5", football player, but I can be all sorts of other things that are really awesome. And this is how I'm going to develop myself. So just for those of you who are in that scenario, go back and listen to those episodes.
Yeah, we'll link in the show notes to those, and you can always pull them up under the Awkward Bot or look them up in the membership. So let's do quick science on growth among boys and the typical path through. So, and actually, let's complete the thought on girls first. So girls tend to enter their growth spurt a little bit earlier than boys. They tend to finish it sooner because their growth spurt is shorter. It's usually 2 to 3 years, not 2 to 4 years. And remember, they're growing 2 to 3 inches, not 3 to 4 inches. So they gain this height. Girls are not done growing in general until 2 years after their period becomes regular. I think this is going to be the social media clip for this episode, because this is really what parents of girls want to know. Is my girl done growing when she gets her period? No, she is not. For all the reasons that we just explained, how estrogen and the growth plates interact, really the best predictor of when a girl is totally done growing is 2 years after a regular period, not 2 years after the period started. And this is significant because if you have a growth spurt for 2 to 3 years, you're going to eke out a little bit more height until you hit that 2 years after a regular period moment. It's objective. It's measurable. We don't have that same marker for boys. So I'm going to tell you the boy science, but it's a little bit fuzzier because they don't conveniently have a period for us. So boys tend to go into their growth spurt a little bit later. I have seen boys who do not go into their growth spurt until junior or senior year of high school. I mean, there are some true late blooming boys. Remember, this is towards the end, Tanner stage 4 of puberty. So they grow 3 to 4 inches a year for 2 to 4 years. It's really important to mention the late bloomers here in the context of height gain, because before your growth spurt, on average, kids are growing about 1.5 inches per year. Late bloomers tend to slow down their non-growth spurt height gain. So instead of growing 1.5 inches or so a year before their growth spurt, they slow down, and some of them grow 1 inch a year or 0.5 inch a year. So they've already done what's called fallen off the growth chart, because as their pediatrician is plotting them, instead of following whatever their typical growth trajectory is, they're now starting to look like they're not gaining height effectively. And now they're really gaining height more slowly than the other kids their age. The other kids their age are in a growth spurt, and they are actually in the opposite of a growth spurt. They're going super slow. And this is really important to acknowledge, because it can feel to a late blooming boy like everyone is massively taller. And I will say, for a late blooming boy, some kids are massively taller. I mean, it is not uncommon to see towards the end of middle school a 1.5 foot difference between the shortest boy in a class and the tallest boy in a class. That is not like a crazy outlier situation. When late blooming boys finally get their growth spurt, they grow 3 to 4 inches a year for 2 to 4 years. But they've essentially lost some of the height gain that other kids would have had in advance of their growth spurt. So you might think if they're later blooming, they're going to end up taller than everyone because they had more growth before. But most late bloomers start on the shorter side, become relatively even shorter, and their rapid height gain does not get them typically, there are some that get to average. I'm sure there's some that beat average, but the typical is they're still going to be shorter than average. I know that was a very confusing way through.
No, I mean, I've heard you say it before. I don't know how our listeners are going to feel. But
they might have to press rewind 100 times.
There's, I know examples of kids who were the latest blooming and ended up taller than everybody else. And kids who weren't, who didn't and ended up average or below. I mean, there's every option under the sun. And what I'm interested in often is what the emotional impacts are, the lifelong impacts are for having gone through one's particular journey, and giving kids an opportunity to talk about what that feels like and having outlets for them, maybe not to talk to us, but other adults they trust. And if you have a kid who's an early blooming kid, a late blooming kid, a kid who's, not ending up where they thought they would or wish they would, if they don't want to talk to you, find someone who you trust, who they can, a cousin, a camp counselor, a family friend who they can have a conversation with. Cara, we're going to talk about midparental height equation. And I also want to make sure we talk about when should people see an endocrinologist? When do kids need to be on growth hormones? Like is there concern about growth spurts?
Yeah. So let's do that first, and then we'll land with the midparental height equation, because everyone's just going to want to jump off the podcast and go do the math. First of all, I'm a big believer in using your general healthcare provider to be the source of referrals for your specialty care. So while it's absolutely fine for individuals to reach out to, say, an endocrinologist, a hormone doctor, without the permission of their primary care doctor, their pediatrician or family doctor, it tends to work better. The system tends to work better when you start with the generalist and they refer you to the specialist. And the main reason is that the generalist will need to send your notes to the specialist. The specialist has to see how you've been growing over the past many, many years. They need to look at the health history. Remember, we keep alluding to these things that you can do to help growth. Well, there are things that can stunt growth. Chronic illness can stunt growth. Think about kids who have bad asthma. Sometimes the bad asthma stunts their growth because they're not getting oxygen delivery to their tissues the way they need to. Sometimes it's the treatment for the asthma, like a kid who's been on multiple courses of steroids who faces limited growth and is not going to reach their growth potential. Certainly kids who have managed illnesses like cancer are going to have a different growth trajectory. So, yes, let's hope that a self-referring parent tells an endocrinologist his history, but it's a whole heck of a lot easier if the chart travels with the kid. And I can say as a physician, reading through and seeing what other physicians found and what they were thinking is gold. It is gold.
And a lot of people can't get an appointment without a referral from their primary care doctor. So
That's
insurance correct. May not cover it. And a doctor's office, a specialist office may not take an appointment if your insurance plan requires a referral. So there's both medical reasons and practical reasons why start with your primary physician and then get a referral. And who would you be referred to, Cara, in this case?
So generally endocrinologists handle growth. In some cities, in small towns and small cities, it might be one pediatric endocrinologist that handles every hormone issue. So it might be they handle diabetes and they handle growth issues and they handle issues related to periods. And, they sort of do a mishmash. Here in LA, where you are in New York, very often The subspecialists super subspecialize. So there are endocrinologists who handle growth, and they have a distinct practice from the endocrinologists who handle diabetes. And it's only the case in big cities like that because because there are enough subspecialists that they can find their niche and do their thing if that's how they choose to practice. I'll also add, for those who are wondering how nutrition plays into all this, nutrition plays a massive role. And for kids who have had intestinal issues, who have seen a gastroenterologist, who are picky eaters, whether they've been diagnosed with something or not, it is really important to know that nutritional status and growth go hand in hand. And it's kind of a no-brainer, but not always. So when any doctor, a generalist or a specialist, is starting to look at height gain and try to figure out why is a kid not growing enough, they will often look at the gut. They will look for things like celiac disease or inflammatory bowel disease markers, so Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. They're looking for things that might explain why a body is not growing in a predicted way.
And sleep. So kids grow when they sleep. And if you have a kid whose growth you're concerned about, look at how much they're sleeping. Now, sleeping a lot is not going to make you surpass your genetic destiny in terms of height, but it will, getting enough sleep over the many years of growing up will help you at least reach your genetic potential in terms of height. But kids who are not sleeping enough, who are on screens, who are cramming, who are overscheduled, who are dealing with, emotional issues that are preventing them from getting enough sleep. This is a way that really motivates kids to want to get enough sleep when they realize it impacts their growth.
So we're going to stick the landing with the mid-parental height equation. So get your pencils out or your ChatGPT out. Here it is. So the mid-parental height equation basically honors the fact that the female and male growth spurts happen at different times, extend over different periods of time, and have different amounts of height. And here's how. For a young girl, if you're trying to figure out what her adult height will be, you take the height of her genetic mother and in inches. This is all very US based. I should have the metric equation down, but I don't. You take her height, the mother's height in inches, you add it to the father's height in inches minus 5. So essentially, the genetic father, if he had been female, it's presumed he would have been 5 inches shorter as a female. So genetic mother plus genetic father minus 5, all in inches, divided by 2. That's averaging out the genetic mother's height and the genetic father's height if he was to be a female. So Vanessa, given that rationale, you want to do for a boy how to predict?
Well, I'm just saying my daughter falls exactly in this equation.
Of course she does, because she read the book and she
follows instructions. My sons, however, do not at all.
Do not. Well, and I should add, the answer is plus or minus 2 inches. And that's actually very important. And it doesn't mean all kids will meet this. And in your family, because I've sat around your dinner table enough times, this will surprise no one. Vanessa's kids are an exception to the rule. So they have a giant and he sprouted from the earth. No one knows.
People meet my husband and they're like, wait, is he the father? Because they cannot believe that our giant son came from the sperm of my totally medium-sized husband.
I thought you were going to say spawn, but you just went there and said sperm. That's awesome.
Yes. So for boys, for males, it's the genetic mom's height. So I'm 5'6". You add 5 inches. So 5'11".
That's right? What you would have been.
That's what I would have been. Plus my husband's height, which is 5'10".
Mm-hmm.
And then you divide by 2.
Divided by 2 average. So again, for a boy, you take the maternal height plus 5 in inches, add the paternal height and divide by 2. So Vanessa's kids, her sons should be 5'10.5", give or take 2 inches. And I will just tell you, she is maybe we'll post a picture of you with your firstborn to prove that the mid-parental height equation is not always right.
I have a picture of him. I actually think Roger posted something recently. I posted a picture of him with our oldest, and he literally looks like his child. My husband looks like the child of my son. But that's the thing. It's like, yes, there's predicting. Yes, you can have its ends. And by the way, I mean, Cara, this will surprise you not at all. My mother says to me on an annual basis, let's say I was originally 5'7". Now I'm like 5'6.5". She will say to me on an annual basis, you were meant to be taller. You were supposed to be 5'9". So for those of you whose genetic skew tells you your kid is meant to be one way or another, or at their 2-year or 3-year appointment, the doctor did the prediction for you of how tall you, don't turn around to your child when they're 16 or 18 or 25, or in my case, 48.
Tell them what they were meant to be.
And tell them what they were meant to be. Because I have to tell you, it does not feel so great to have the lovely thing about my children is that they actually think I'm so much taller than I am.
You present taller than you are. I mean, you are the embodiment of confidence. You do take up more vertical space.
A lot of space.
It's really awesome.
They think Roger's 5'10". I'm, let's say, somewhere between 5'6" and 5'7". And they're like, wait, Mom, you're taller than Dad, right? Like they think I'm like 5'10" and they think Roger's like 5'6". So this is all of that is to say that the equation is fascinating and wonderful and super fun, and it doesn't effing matter.
And I want to add one last thing before we wrap, which is you can imagine there are other things that cause people to not gain height. One of the most classic is scoliosis.
Mm-hmm.
So it tends to happen to girls more than boys, but it happens to both genders. If the spine is not straight, you will not achieve the height that's predicted by the mid-parental height equation because the spine's not straight. So many reasons to just, if you have questions, check in with your pediatrician or ask the Awkward Bot.
And this is the age where they'll have your kids start to bend over, touch their toes, and they'll look at the curve in the spine, and maybe they'll refer you to somebody else, or maybe there isn't a curve in the spine, and maybe it's not what they think it is, and it gets very stressful. I mean, there's all these things that can be very stressful and then turn out to be fine. And then there are all these things that are stressful and actually require further investigation and testing and conversation and advice. And this is a moment where I will just say a parent can often look around at everybody else and everybody else's kid and everybody else's family and think, I am the only one. My kid is the only one. They are the last one or the first one or whatever it is. And we are just here to say, you are not the only one. It may feel like it. You're not alone. Your kid is not alone. You can get the advice you need. You can speak to the specialist you need. And sometimes that's just to give a kid reassurance that it's all going to be okay, just maybe not on the timeline they hoped.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks, Cara.
Thanks, tall Vanessa.
I'm secretly 6'5". Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.